We are joined live from Israel by Rick Grenell. Rick, first, why don't you give our listeners a bit of an update of why you're there and what's going on?
Well, I am part of the delegation for CPAC Israel. It's very exciting. We'll be spending a couple of days here. I'm at the King David Hotel, so I'm sure you know exactly where I am. And the sun has set, and it's a beautiful, beautiful night in Jerusalem.
Awesome. That's so great to hear. I haven't been back to Israel in a few years, but yeah, I know exactly where you are. You're kind of there in an interesting time when President Biden, he ends his trip to the Middle East coming up, and we talked about earlier in this show, you had a senior advisor to the Ayatollah in Iran saying, we have the ability to build a nuclear bomb. Do you think, though, based on what you've seen, and obviously we've talked about the fist bump, we've talked about all the issues that have happened in this trip, do you think that's a direct response to sort of the weakness that we're seeing from this administration in the Middle East?
Yeah, look, we're here for a little bit of Republican response, I guess, here in Israel. And it's clear that the trip was not good for President Biden. He made fundamental mistakes the whole time. He is not well received in the region. Certainly the Saudis remember that he wanted them to be a pariah state. His administration has worked really hard to really ruin relations with Saudi Arabia. And then, basically he showed up with gas cans begging for some help. And I think he needs to be a little bit more strategic. If you're going to somehow make Saudi Arabia a pariah state, you can't expect to come back and get favors. And I think whether it's the Emiratis or the Saudis, they're all now correcting the record. They started correcting the record pretty fast once Joe Biden got in the air. And so I would just say to the White House, you've got to be much more strategic about your language and what you're trying to do. Certainly, we know the Iran deal is in trouble. And what is the Biden administration's response going to be now that their premier focus for an Iran deal has fallen apart?
Well, and as the Iranians now are kind of promoting this, they hadn't in the past been open saying that they had the technological capability of building a nuclear bomb and things, but we see this out of the senior advisor to the Ayatollah. Now they're strategically, I would feel like, releasing this information, saying, we haven't decided if we're going to build a bomb, but we do have the technical capability. Do you think that we always thought that Iran had much more capability than they were being open about, but do you think that now this pivot is a new challenge that we see when facing the Iranians, especially as the Biden administration still tries to push for a diplomatic response?
I've been working on this issue with Iran since 2001, since I started at the United Nations. And I have to say that one thing I've learned over 20 plus years of working on this issue is we can always count on the Iranians to completely mess up the situation. And so we have, a frustration in the U.S. with Iran. I think the Europeans are frustrated with Iran. But for the Iranian regime now to come out and say that they're close to a nuclear weapon or they're going to get one is really remarkable because it's exactly what we thought all along. We know from the very beginning that the Iranians have lied about the number of centrifuges and the weaponization, and that we've known they've lied about the heavy water amount that they have accumulated. So there's all sorts of evidence showing that we cannot trust the Iranians. I'm not sure why the Biden administration has decided to trust them and start a negotiation again, but it seems to be the pattern that the Biden administration keeps trusting what these people say, and yet we have so much evidence that they've lied from the beginning. I'm actually pleased that they're coming out and now confronting what the Biden team has said, that they weren't close, they weren't right there at the limits, and now the Iranians are admitting that they are.
Yep.
And so we're being saved by the Iranians here.
Interesting perspective on that. Let's take a phone call. I think a lot of people have a lot of these issues. Nick in D.C. Nick, thanks for holding. You're on the air.
Thank you for taking my call. My quick question is, why on earth would the Obama and Biden administration negotiate and give terrorists so much? And why? What is their excuse? And what do you guys think the real reason is?
Rick, I'll punt this over to you. What do you think the real reason is?
Yeah, it's a great question, but I think I've said this a number of times. The opposite of America First is consensus with the Europeans. Joe Biden has placed a priority on having consensus with Europeans. And what that means is that you take the European position and you take the American position and you somehow meet in the middle. And I don't think that that's a smart diplomatic move. Both sides don't get what they want. Some people would argue compromise is good in this situation. I would argue that it's the lowest common denominator of what we both agree, and it's actually terrible all the way around. So the long answer is that Joe Biden cares more about keeping all of Europe together, Europe applauding the policy position, and he isn't necessarily looking at what's best for the American people or Europeans or people around the world.
Final question here. When we see Iran going in one direction, and we know that Biden is still going to pursue the diplomatic way to try to resolve this, in a sense, when you started under the Trump administration with others, the Abraham Accords, which brought Israel closer to the Gulf states than they ever had been before. Do you think if the Biden administration continues down the wrong path in dealing with this, it will only encourage Israel to continue to foster those relationships with the Gulf states and even Saudi Arabia to confront the threat of Iran?
I do, and I think not only is it going to empower the Israelis to continue trying to find common ground with some of the Arab states, but I think it also compels the Arab states. What we have to remember is that Iran is wildly unpopular, and no one knows the bad behavior and the lies of the Iranian regime more than those who live in the neighborhood, the neighbors of Iran. And so I think that it's very, very clear that they're pushing the Iranians out, and we're trying to get the Israelis and the Arab states to find a way forward with peace.
All right, Rick. Well, thank you so much for joining us again live from Israel.